Okay, so we took a sheet of mixed media paper, we divided it into 4, and now we're just testing out how the paints react when used in different ways, okay, before we actually apply the paint to our canvas or to our final watercolor sheet. Okay, so the first technique is going to be putting wet paint on dry paint. The one next to it is going to be putting wet paint onto wet paint. So wet on wet. The one below that is going to be gradient. Okay, otherwise known as ombre effect. So we had wet on dry here. I'm just doing it twice over. Wet on wet. Okay, and then this one here is going to be dry brush. So whether you're using acrylic or you're using watercolor, these are probably going to be the most common methods that you'll be using while developing the layers of your painting. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start with watercolor. So if you're watercolor folk, you can rip out your watercolor set. And again, this is just going to be a really quick exercise where you get to see how the paints feel layered on top of each other so that you don't panic mid-painting. Okay, so again, keep your paper towel nearby, and if you're working with watercolor, you need wells. Okay, so I recommend that for this fun little activity, you just choose tubes of paint that you feel like aren't necessarily a big option for your final painting. So if you have any colors that you see here, maybe you need all of them. Maybe obviously there are some that maybe you just have a lot of because you haven't been using them a lot. I've got a ton of green here, so I might use some green in this. I'm gonna play around with a little bit of white. Maybe I'll use some of this phthalo blue. I haven't used much of that. And maybe a red. Okay, I'm just gonna play around with these colors, but you guys choose a couple of colors on your own. And I'm gonna go ahead and squeeze a bit into each of my watercolor palettes. So I've got 3 random colors and a white. And I don't want to squeeze out a ton of white because white is going to get used a lot in your final painting, but at least you can see what it looks like being layered here. This one's never been opened. Okay, so this is watercolor. It does not work without having water added to it. Whether you got a brush set with larger brushes or you're sticking to your smaller brushes, I do recommend that you do the painting using flat brushes again because it gives you a thicker line and then it gives you a thinner line when you move the brush sideways. So most versatile type of brush. Don't use a round brush. Okay, and again, when I'm adding water, I'm kind of just scooping it in with There is one more that I actually want to show you guys how to do. So if you have room, maybe on the back, okay, your back 4, also add wash, flat wash. Do a flat wash, and what other one comes to mind? And values, maybe do values. Okay, so now we have wet on dry, wet on wet, gradient, ombre effect, dry brush, and flat wash, and different values. Okay, so let's start with a flat wash. The flat wash is basically when you take quite a bit of water. A flat wash is ideal for working on the sky. Oftentimes you'll start with a flat wash for the background of a watercolor painting. So you're going to take like several scoops of water. I want to say 4 or 5, and you're going to take a little bit of any color. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use the blue, and I'm going to introduce some of that color into quite a large puddle of water. So it's really thinned out. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to create a consistent color on here that's really, really thin and really translucent. So if you have a thicker brush, it's ideal for a flat wash. If you have a little brush, you just have to be patient and move really quickly. Okay, I'm going to try it with a slightly larger brush here. Okay, so I'm going to scoop out some of the color, and it's going to be super runny. And my goal is going to be to move the paint around and have it absorb in a really even fashion. So there's no lighter or darker areas. It's nice and even. It's almost like dropping an Easter egg into dye and pulling it out, and it's just an even coat. Okay, so this is what I call a flat wash, or what you call a flat wash when you're working with watercolor. It's a very diluted watercolor, and it gives you a very translucent coat of color, which is a great way to start off your sky or a body of water, especially when you're working with a light blue. And again, based on how much water you add, the more clearer, the more translucent the coat of color is going to be. So with watercolor, you don't necessarily have to add white to make a color lighter. You can just add a lot of water to it. And watercolor, again, it works like stained glass. It's just supposed to be translucent layers of color. And they work best when one is dry and you layer the other, okay? So let's test that out. Let's test out what wet paint looks like when it goes on dry paint. So let's do another wash in here. Okay, I'm gonna take water, scoop it back into this well here, and I'm gonna take some of my blue and bring it in. Okay, and take my brush, and on my wet on dry, I'm gonna do a flat wash in the background. And when you're doing a wash, you have to move quickly. You'll notice that watercolor paper, when applied to the right kind of paper, very absorbent paper, absorbs really quickly and immediately starts to dry. Okay, so to get a nice consistent flat wash, you have to just move very quickly and make sure you don't have any wet globs left behind. Okay, so we're gonna let this dry, and then we're gonna try to see what wet paint looks like on top of this. On this one here, beside it, let's try to do wet on wet. So again, for a third time, I'm gonna take water and I'm gonna add it to my well here, and I'm gonna scoop some color into it. Okay, this time I'm gonna do a wash on this side, but before I let it dry, I'm gonna start adding other colors to it. So I'm gonna dip my brush in some water too, make it nice and wet. And we're gonna do something similar with the acrylics, but of course acrylics react very differently. Okay, so now basically you're working on your painting. Say you're working on your sky and you want to add another color onto here. I'm gonna turn off my light just because the reflections are causing a weird, or the the paper bending is causing word reflections. Okay, so say now you want to create some clouds. So I'm going to take some of my white, and now this is wet white going on wet blue paint. So notice that when I put my white on top of the blue, you can hardly see it. It's almost like disappearing into the bottom layer of blue. Okay, so I literally scooped up some white paint onto a clean brush. So if you don't have a clean brush, rinse your brush, scoop out some wet white paint and put it onto your wet blue. Notice that nothing is showing up. It's like mixing back in with the bottom paint. If anything, it's like scratching off the bottom layer of paint a little bit. Okay, so I'm not seeing much of a difference. It's just kind of moving the paint around. Okay, so long story short, wet on wet is not a good way to go when you're using watercolor. It's actually a very ineffective technique. Okay, so I would just put a sad face in this square. Okay, wet on wet is not something that you're going to be reaching to do a lot when you're using watercolors. With watercolors, they're a lot of fun, but you have to wait for every single layer to dry. Okay, on this hand, okay, we're gonna wait for this to absolutely dry. So this is still damp to the touch right now, so I'm not gonna go and add any paint color to wet on dry until it's like super dry. Okay, so let's just leave that one for now. Below you're gonna see gradient or ombre. This means you're going to be blending one color with another color, and you want it to softly transition. Okay, so let's say we have blue and we want to turn the blue into a green. Say you're working on a sky and your sky goes from blue to green, which is uncommon. Maybe someone's sky is going to go from orange to blue or from red to blue. Actually, you know what? In that case, why don't I mix a pink color? So say your sky goes from blue to pink. So let's mix some water into my red. And to turn this into a pink color, I need to add a little bit of white. Actually, I'll just add my red to the white here. And I dump some water in here. Make it nice and pink. Okay, so this time I want to blend blue and pink, or I want to have one color melt into the other color without having an obvious transition. So again, you're going to work quick and you're going to work with wet on wet. If you want to blend two colors seamlessly in watercolor, they both have to be wet. Okay, so here I'm going to start off pretending that my sky starts off blue. Okay, I'm going to do like maybe 2 or 3 layers of a wash. Okay, now you're going to rinse your brush. Okay, and then put the wet brush into your next color. Okay, and say your sky turns into a pink here. So the lower part of your sky is pink, but you want these two blended. While they're wet, go in and kind of mix the two together, and it's going to create a medium color of purple. And you want to just slowly brush it out into the opposite direction. Okay, do you see that? So it's a nice soft transition. It's very hard to tell at what point the pink met the blue, because you've got that kind of soft lavender transition. The only way you're going to get a soft transition between any two colors when you're using watercolor is making sure that you use both when they're soaking wet. Okay, so apply one in a generous amount, clean your brush, apply the second one, and then kind of mix them in the middle and then draw it back out so it reabsorbs as it's transitioning into the other color.